Hello and welcome to Chess Goblin. In this video, you will learn the Alien Gambit, an opening recently popularized by Volin Drolgerov, or better known as Witty Alien. I learned this opening a couple months ago, and it has become one of my favorite openings. So in the Alien Gambit, you are white, and you start off with e4, and your opponent has to play a Caro Kann. You take a second pawn in the center, and they initiate the Caro Kann. And then you have to defend your pawn in the center by either develop your knight here or here. It doesn't really matter. And you want your opponent to capture your pawn. If they do a different move like bring out their knight, then you can't play the Alien Gambit and you just have to continue development from there. But for the Alien Gambit to work, they capture your pawn, you recapture with your knight, and now there's two common moves that black does here. Either bring out their bishop to attack your knight, or they bring out their knight to attack your knight. And I will show you later what happens with a bishop, but the most common move is they attack with a knight. And then instead of trading it off, you sidestep it, trying to pull out this pawn. And most of the time, they will attack you with this pawn. I will show you later what happens if they do not attack you right away. But here, you sacrifice your knight, and black has to capture or they lose their rook. And then here, it's important not to try to check their king right away with your bishop. Stockfish will want you to do that, but you are behind material, and Stockfish is playing it as if you are equal. But since we're not equal, we have to make sure all our pieces are at the party before we start checking the king. And here we develop our knight. And black can do a number of moves here. They can develop their bishop here or here. They can bring the other knight up. They can push this pawn, and on rare occasions, they retreat their king. The most common move that black does in this position is they try to pin your knight to your queen. And this is a blunder. The most common move in this position with the Alien Gambit is a blunder. That's how you know this position is good, and this opening is so fatal. Because you can check the king, and you're attacking the bishop with your knight and your queen. And there's a couple moves black can do here. They can go back here, and what I like to do in this position, I like to develop my bishop. That's actually a mistake, though. It's not a good move because black can bring their queen out and sacrifice it on the knight. And after you recapture, they trade queens. I've never had an opponent that I've played see that, but it's important to know when you're behind in chess, trading queens you should never do. If you're behind in chess, do not trade queens because your queen is the piece that will dig you out of the hole when you're in trouble. So the best move to do in this position, instead of bringing my bishop out, is to just capture the bishop, and after we trade knights, you are up a pawn, and black cannot castle. They have a big hole in front of their king, and you have your queen development. You have strong attacks here, and you're doing good. The other way they can play it is if they move their king back. And in this position, the black bishop, you already have it guaranteed. So you continue the initiative with your bishop. And there's a couple things black can do here. They can move their king over, which actually leads to mate in 4 moves after you attack with the queen. And they can either block with the bishop, the knight, the pawn, and whatever they do, it leads to checkmate. The other way they can play is they block it with a pawn. And here you trade off the knight or the bishop with your knight, and then after they recapture, you win back another pawn because after they move here, you get their knight also. There's another way they can defend it is with their knight, and then you just win back their bishop. So whatever they do after this, it's bad for black, and you are doing good as white. The other move they can do is bishop to f5. And this is a rule of thumb to know in the Alien Gambit. In this position, if black moves out their bishop, you move knight. And vice versa, if black develops their knight, you develop your bishop. So you move out the opposite piece, as black does. So after black moves its bishop out, you develop your knight, and this is the most common move, retreating the king, and then you attack with your bishop. And now the most natural move the black does here is they try to block the check with the pawn. And in this spot, you attack their bishop with your pawn, trying to pull their bishop off this diagonal and try to get away the protector that's on this pawn. Because if they capture our pawn, we recapture with our knight, and right here, we're going to be up material here. The other way they can play it is if they're trying to create counterattack, they attack our rook in the corner. And here, since their defender is off the pawn, we capture the pawn, they have to move their king up here, and then we push our pawn. Because if they take our rook in the corner, it's checkmate with a pawn. So if they move their pawn up here behind their bishop, you attack the bishop from the other side. Another way they can try to defend it is they move their knight here. And here, I like moving my queen out to attack the bishop here and then put more pressure on this f7 square. Another way they can play it is they don't develop their bishop. Instead, they develop their knight. And as the rule of thumb I explained earlier, if they develop their knight, you develop the opposite piece, you develop your bishop. And you can either develop them here or here in this scenario. And this is something else to remember about the Alien Gambit. It is an opening similar to that of like a Queen's Gambit. It's an opening, and I can give you some good ideas of how it works, but it's not like a scholar's mate. It's not just you remember these 4 moves and this guarantees where they will go from here. There's a lot of things black can do, and they are able to defend this opening if they play perfectly. And there's multiple ways that you can play this opening as white. This is one way you can play, and then they can block with a pawn. And in this scenario, I'm bringing my queen to e2, putting more pressure on this pawn. And if they don't defend it, like they move their bishop up, that actually leads to mate. After queen goes up here, they bring their king over, and then you just hunt down their king. They go here, here, and then this is mate. So if they don't defend this pawn, it will lead to mate. But they might bring their queen over, and what you do here is you just castle, bring your rook over, and put more pressure on this pawn. You just keep stockpiling pressure on this pawn. And the opening principles of the Alien Gambit are pretty simple. You bring out your knight, your bishop either here or here. You bring the queen up, you castle, and then you push your pieces through the center and just keep stockpiling pressure on black. Another way they can play this opening is they just push their pawn right away. They just push this pawn. And here I don't like attacking with my bishop because it's just running into this pawn. So I put my bishop on d3. And here, often black will try to bring more pieces up in the center around their king and create like a little wall in front of their king. And here, you just want to castle, bring your rook over, and start punching through the center. A lot of the time, black will move their bishop up, and here, just bring your rook over, and black has the idea they're going to try to castle manually, bring the rook over and bring their king through. So like if you bring the rook over, you actually should do this move with the knight. Because if they capture with your knight, or their knight, they run into this fork with a pawn. So what most people do in this position is they recapture with a bishop. And then you recapture with your pawn. They can't capture back with their knight because they see it's defended by the rook, so they try to move this knight. And that was the main idea of this move with the knight up. You want to get this knight off of defending this square because you want your queen to go over to this square. So after you bring up your knight, they recapture with the bishop, and then they retreat their knight. You bring your queen over to check the king. And if they go here, this actually leads you to mate. You can sacrifice your bishop because after you take, they will end up losing their queen in the corner because then they go here. If they go here, You end up losing the queen. So much strong attacks if they move here. So the common move for black to do is after you check their king with your queen, they move to the back row, try to hide behind these pawns, and you can actually sacrifice your bishop on this pawn. Because if they take, this just leads to checkmate. This is another main idea that you can do with the alien gambit. You can sacrifice this bishop on this pawn here. And that was the idea at the very beginning of why you try to pull this pawn out on the H file, because you are planning on later sacrificing your bishop on it later in the game. And if they don't recapture your bishop with the pawn, for example, they try to bring their queen over to defend this pawn, you just bring your rook up and swing them over and start stockpiling more pressure in front of the king. Even though we're behind material, even Stockfish says that we're up by almost 4 points right here. The other thing that black sometimes does in here, which I've never seen in my game, but I had a recent subscriber ask what happens if the king moves back to one of these squares. If the king moves back here, I like going d3 with the idea of this diagonal here. Threatening this diagonal, bringing your knight up, and then castling and just pushing your rook through the center. And in here, a lot of people will bring their knight over, and this is just mate in one. If they block, another idea of bringing my bishop here is if they block this square, it's mate in one. I checked a lot of databases on this position in chess and the other position if their king moves back to either of these squares, and it's a rare move that the king moves back to either of these squares. I've never had it happen in any of my games, but it is a possibility that the king does that. And even when the king moves back here, Stockfish thinks it's equal. Even though we're down a knight, black lost their advantage by moving their king back. And most of the time, black just blocks this square and just hangs checkmate in one. And the principles of the alien gambit are not much different if the king retreats to either one of these squares. You still bring out the bishop here, you castle, bring the queen over to the center, and attack through the middle. Another way I like playing this is bringing the queen up and over, and if the king is hiding behind this pawn, you can often sacrifice the bishop on this pawn. There's another way that black attacks the knight in the middle. What I said earlier, they attack it with the bishop. And in here, you can still go after the alien gambit, because if they attack you with this pawn, you still sacrifice it on this pawn, the king moves out, and most of the time, they will bring out their knight. And this is the same position I showed you earlier. If their bishop is out, you attack with your knight. And it goes down the same thing that I showed you earlier. They can also move back here, which is bad after you bring out your bishop. And the strong attacks after you bring up this knight, you bring your rook over and smash him through the center. Another thing you might want to try in this position is you could try to just target this bishop. In this position, it's very hard for black to defend this bishop. And they have to bring it back there if they want to defend it. And black is just completely losing if they do that. Like Stockfish says, they're almost -5 in this position. The best thing for black to do here is just develop their other knight and just be okay with losing their bishop. That's the best thing black can do here. The other thing black might do is they might not push this pawn. They might know the alien gambit and they might have played in one of their games and just don't want to push this pawn. So instead, they just try to keep development. And here, you can still target this pawn either with your bishop going here, but since they push their pawn up, you want to develop your other knight, bring him up over, and attack this pawn. And if they don't attack you here, you can, and they just want to castle, you can still target this pawn with your knights. Because if they try to kick it away, now they're fell into the fork again.